Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank all the commissioners for being here. I wanted to ask Commissioner Rosenworcel, this is an issue that I've raised, I think, repeatedly before the Commission when you've come before the Senate committee, and that is the Universal Service Fund issue. I appreciate some of the reforms that you've made on the distribution side, and obviously there's some additional issues that have been raised here today with the chairman that I hope are also addressed on the distribution side. But I continue to remain concerned on the contribution side because my state, again, I urge you all, if you would like to take a nice trip through New Hampshire and to the same, I have the same experience in many rural parts of New Hampshire, Commissioner Clyburn, where there is not coverage, and this is really important. But we're 50th in terms of support under the Universal Service Fund. We are a net donor where my constituents are paying $37 million in a year, and they're getting back $15 million in return. It's a very bad deal for my constituents, given that we have real needs in my state and in very important parts of my state, that it would help the economic development and well-being of my constituents. And so I wanted to ask you, I know that as the chair of the Federal-State Joint Board, Commissioner, you have really said, I'm going to wait on what you might do on contribution reform based on what the court does on the open internet order. And I'm trying to understand why we have to wait, because, you know, recently the Congress, again, this time permanently enacted the Internet Tax Freedom Act, which would say, I think, very, very clearly where policymakers are on both sides of the aisle on this issue, that we should take, you know, we should ensure that you aren't taxed when you have access to the internet, because we want to make sure everyone has access, and that's obviously the goal of the Universal Fund itself. So I would ask you, Commissioner, why do we have to wait for the open internet order to make reforms to the contribution side, especially when Congress has so clearly spoken, most recently with a permanent extension of the Internet Tax Freedom Act, because my constituents are really tired of waiting for contribution reform, and they're spending a lot, they're putting a lot of money into this, and we're not getting the value back from the fund.
All right. Thank you, Senator. And you're right, we have talked about this extensively. I want to start by saying I am a New Englander. That's where I grew up. So I know exactly what you speak of in terms of the inability to get service in parts of New Hampshire and northern New Hampshire in particular.
That's right.
So that's familiar to me. And to the extent that you're saying that we are not acting, I just want you to know that we're actually working. We're working extensively behind the scenes. Just 2 weeks ago, I met in Washington with my state colleagues who are on the joint board, who are from all across the country, Florida, Washington State, Michigan, and state staff who are from other locations. And we talked extensively about new models for moving forward, because our existing universal service system, which supports communications in so much of rural America, is right now dependent on an assessment on old-fashioned long-distance service, which we all know does not represent the future of communications. And if we want to make sure that we get high-speed broadband everywhere, including places in New Hampshire, we know we're going to have to update the way that we collect that. And we are working behind the scenes now, combing over models and trying to understand the impact on consumers and businesses if changes are made.
So the thing that I would like to understand, and I'd also like Commissioner Pai to jump in because I know he's expressed some opinions on this as well, why does the open internet order jeopardize the potential to do contribution reform, and what risk are we with this open internet order that in fact it could end up with a universal service tax on internet services, which presumably would be contradictory to the policy that is very strongly bipartisan as reflected in ITFA, that we don't want to tax access to the internet. So if you could both comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
So I want to be clear, I agree with that policy. We're not looking to change it. We're just looking to modernize the system. To the extent that we're talking about why this court case matters, it's just fundamentally statutory. Under Section 254D of the Communications Act, the collection obligation is on telecommunications services, and so we need to make sure that that definition is a stable one so that we assess ways to move forward. And we're looking at a variety of ways: numbers-based contributions, expanding the contribution base with traditional telephony. We're looking at a connections-based system. In other words, we're looking at models with our state colleagues from all across the country right now with the goal of making sure that rural communications stay strong.
I would like to have Commissioner Pai, with the chairman's latitude, also comment on this issue.
Thank you, Senator. I'll try to be brief. I have concerns both in terms of timing and in substance. In terms of timing, when the FCC adopted the Open Internet Order on February 26, 2015, the Joint Board was slated to give us a recommendation on contributions reform in April of 2015. If you look buried in footnote 1471 of the 317-page order, we say we anticipate a short extension of the Joint Board's deadline would be appropriate. We are now almost over a year after the Open Internet Order. We still have no recommendation. Now, I think that it's pretty clear that a broadband internet access tax would be pretty unpopular, especially in light of the bipartisan chorus, as you pointed out, that state and local governments should not be able to tax the same. And I think it's remarkable that in light of the fact that the FCC has declined to refrain from opposing these regulations on all these other areas, all these other Title II regulations, that this one, a politically salient one, is being put off for a later time. And I think that it's also telling that the agency is already spending money in anticipation of getting a greater amount of revenue from the Universal Service Fund. For example, we boosted the E-rate budget by $1.5 billion a year last year. By all accounts, next month we are going to expand the Lifeline program to broadband without any meaningful budget or cap. And so that money is already being spent, and it has to come from somewhere. And I would respectfully submit to you that ultimately it is going to be in the form of a broadband tax. Every one of your constituents is going to have to pay more for internet access to fund the FCC spending obligations it's already made through the Universal Service Fund. And so both in terms of timing and substance, I believe that we should be straightforward with the American people and decline this opportunity to impose a broadband tax.
Well, I hope we would. My constituents are not going to want to pay that tax, and I don't think there's support for that tax, so I hope that we would clearly take that off the table.